Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Azeezah from Project South, and I'm going to facilitate this webinar along with my colleague Manzoor Chima. So Project South is a social justice organization based in Atlanta, and we work with grassroots organizations and Black immigrant and Muslim communities in the US South, and we're also in solidarity with Black and Indigenous communities in the Global South. Project South is a movement building and movement support organization, and we are also an abolitionist organization. So thank you all again for joining us for this discussion. This webinar will highlight lessons from the global movement against colonialism and occupation, and how incarceration is used as a tool of dehumanization by settler colonial states, namely the United States, Israel, and Canada. Folks, please mute yourselves. Folks who are joining, please mute yourselves. Thank you. Okay, so we will hear from grassroots social justice organizers in different parts of the world, and again, namely folks based in Palestine, Kashmir, and Canada, and here in Atlanta, Georgia, on how they're organizing for abolition. And this webinar is part of the Project South Quarterly Connecting Local to Global Struggles webinar series. So the next one is actually going to be in September, so stay tuned for that. So recording and resources are going to be shared after the webinar. So I would like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. We are truly honored to be joined by them. So our first speaker is Basil Farraj, who's a visiting scholar at Muwatin Institute for Democracy and Human Rights in Birzeit University in Palestine. Our second speaker will be Reece, a scholar of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism and carcerality, teaching at X University in Canada. Then we will be joined by Ahmed Bin Qasim, who's a Kashmiri writer and a student of political and economic anthropology. Ahmed is the son of 2 political prisoners. Then we will have Azeezah Kanji, legal scholar and writer in Toronto, Canada. And then we will be joined by Priyanka Bhatt, who is a staff attorney at Project South in Atlanta, Georgia. And the presentations altogether will be about 50 minutes. Each speaker is gonna speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then we will have the last half an hour or so for discussion. So please continue to stay with us after the presentations. So I would now like to turn it over to Basil.
Thank you, Azeezah, and thanks to Project South for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. And a warm greetings to the other presenters. So my talk today it's really hard to discuss Israel's carceral regime in 10 to 15 minutes, but I will try to focus particularly on Israel's use of torture and violence in its interrogation rooms as part of the broader legal structures and the impunity that Israel provides to interrogators, which is also an impunity provided by all branches of the government, of the Israeli government, and to try to allude to how the Palestinian is constantly presented as a subject to be contained, to be controlled, to be constantly under the monitoring and surveillance of the Israeli colonial regime. So to start, I would like to start first by sharing 2 stories that are 50 years apart of torture in interrogation. So the first story belongs to Nader al-Afuri. He was a Palestinian detainee arrested during the early years of Israel's occupation in 1967. This detainee recently passed away, and may his soul rest in peace. So I will start by sharing parts of his testimony. He says, "Suddenly I was brought to Sarafand military prison. They did not call us by our names. I was only given a number. I was prisoner number 1. They played certain machines, strange sounds of interrogation and torture. It was exhausting. My interrogation lasted for 12 minutes and a half. It was brutal. My body still bears signs of torture." Now, this detainee, Nader, was subjected to numerous torture methods. His arrest actually dates back to the early years of Israel's recent occupation, but the particular testimony is from 1978. His interrogation and arrest lasted for 12 months and a half. Now, the second story dates back to 27th of September 2019. On this day, Samer Arbid, a Palestinian father of 3 young children, he was being rushed from the interrogation center in Jerusalem to another hospital in Jerusalem, but in an unconscious state. He had 11 broken ribs, he had renal failure, he had bruises covering all over his body. At that time, actually, the detainee had only spent 2 days in interrogation, but he nearly died. Now, these 2 stories, 50 years apart, again, are not isolated. In fact, Israel's torture and violence of Palestinian detainees is central to its carceral and incarceration project. The Israeli settled colonial state has, over the years, been engaged in laborious legal efforts to deny its omnipresent resort to torture, or at least to justify it. It never refers to it as torture, in fact. It justifies it through meticulously crafted legal codes, internal review mechanisms, and of course, most importantly, by invoking the notion of an ever-present threat, which is epitomized by the Palestinian living body. The current situation is one in which torture in Israeli bars, which is of course hidden from the public eye, is systematically practiced. But it's not only practiced to inflict harm on the Palestinian body, but more importantly, to create a submissive population ready to be inscribed and reformed by power. In this sense, Israel's resort to torture in its various shapes and forms is constantly trying to write power on the Palestinian social and political body. Now, as you might imagine, and I think importantly for our talk here, and because we are approaching the 20th year anniversary of the US invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and the so-called war on terror, interrogation and torture is constantly presented as a prerequisite for obtaining information. Information that's presented as a necessity to quell a most certain and forthcoming danger, as you probably know. The reality, however, is far from that. But since we are talking about global struggles, I want to just share with you a quick note from a CIA memorandum in 2001, which actually quotes the Israeli example. So this CIA memorandum says, and I quote, "If we follow the Israeli example, the CIA could argue that torture was necessary to prevent imminent, significant, and physical harm to persons where there's no other available means to prevent the harm." In this very short quote, we can see that there's a long history of sharing information of interrogation techniques of torture that takes place between the US, between Israel, and many other countries, I assure you. So in this sense, torture has always been central to Israel's carceral regime. In fact, and I don't have the time, unfortunately, to delve into this, but it dates back to Israel's beginning of the occupation of historic Palestine in 1948. But since my time is limited, I want to focus on a short episode, which forms part of the broader, of course, history of torture and violence and incarceration, which dates back to the year 2019. I will try to end with a somewhat brighter note about resistance and transgressions. So near the end of August 2019, Israel launched a crazy campaign of arrests that included numerous dozens of activists and of students. Now, unique about this particular wave of arrest is that these detainees were interrogated with brutal psychological and physical torture methods. Now, many of those detainees were classified by Israel's legal structure as ticking bombs. In this sense, the Israeli security agency has allowed itself to use violent interrogation methods under the pretext of necessity or of preventing a forthcoming harm. Now, the example of the detainee I started with, which is Samer Arbid, is one example. He was interrogated with what Israel refers to as military interrogation tactics. In fact, the majority of those detainees, which included dozens of university students, were subjected to prolonged bans of lawyer visits. They were not allowed to communicate with their families for months, nor with their lawyers, and actually were constantly at the mercy of judges who were complicit already in their interrogation and detention and torture. Now, just to give you a sense of what this torture meant, one of the Palestinian organizations, which is called Ad-Damir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, and I encourage you to look at their work, it had mentioned some of the torture methods that were used. I will just describe a few for you to have a sense of what was taking place. So the banana position, for example, it involves bending the back of the detainee in an arch while sitting on a backless chair. The squatting position, where the detainees were forced to squat while their hands are cuffed to each other and positioned in front of them or behind them. Another tactic was called the rounded chains position, which includes forcing the detainees to lay on the ground with their hands cuffed to iron chains, and while these iron chains are positioned behind their back, creating immense back pain. The other one is called the imaginary chair position, where the detainee is forced to stand in the middle of the interrogation room and squat to a non-existing chair. The frog crouch, which includes forcing the detainee to crouch on the tiptoes in a consecutive and prolonged fashion. Of course, the other methods included suffocating the detainees, pulling their hair, their facial hair, their scalp hair, beating them harshly, and forcing them to sit on a small chair for long hours. It also included prolonged sleep deprivation, threats against their family members, non-stop interrogation sessions, yelling, and cursing. In fact, I was told by many of the family members that this included as well in the fabrication of intimate family videos in order to further psychologically distress the detainees. And also to give you a sense, many of these detainees, their family members were arrested or at least brought to interrogation rooms as a means to place further pressure on the detainees. Again, I have to note that, of course, there's the myth that torture and interrogation are intended to get information, but the reality is not that. The idea is to create a submissive population, to break your will, to break the resistant spirit of the Palestinian community. Now, another testimony, and I have to here mention it because it belongs to a Palestinian student. This student was arrested, eventually charged for taking part of in a conference and student organization. But again, military interrogation tactics were used against her and him in many of the cases. And it included numerous stress positions. Now, again, this case that I have just mentioned and the other ones are not unique. However, the question that must be asked here is not whether or not these cases and these methods amount to torture. In fact, they do. Of course, Israel continues to deny its use of torture. But the real question is, why does this entire security establishment, the Israeli security establishment, use these methods against Palestinian students and eventually charge them with belonging to a Palestinian organization, a student organization, mind you, or participating in a conference? Why would a 22-year-old Palestinian student, which is, in fact, this happened 3 years ago, be brutalized and eventually charged with participating in a media conference? Why? And why would the other question is, why would interrogators continue with their brutal methods after they had obtained the information they supposedly need? And the reality is that they already possessed the information before. So here I argue that torture, Israeli torture in particular, it works to inscribe power over not only the Palestinian detained body, but the entire social and political collective. The real purpose behind torture and interrogation in the Palestinian case is to teach a lesson to Palestinians, to colonize Palestinians, that they should accept to be molded, to be reshaped by Israeli power. In this sense, Israeli violence, and of course we can talk about the broader ramifications of incarceration. The purpose of violence is not violence itself. And actually I argue that the broader effects are worthy of further interrogation. We can perhaps discuss it in the question and answer later on. But again, the aim of Israeli torture and violence, and actually of incarceration as a whole, is to instill fear, to demoralize the Palestinian consciousness and being of Palestinians. Now, again, all of this happens with the backing of all the legal structures, the Israeli High Court of Justice, the Israeli military courts, the Israeli military law, the cover up by medical professionals who are actually present in interrogation rooms, the cover up by interrogators, and in fact, all branches of the Israeli Zionist government. And this is a very important note to end with, because Israel, again, constantly presents itself as a state that does not torture. However, this is far from reality. Israel has constantly been torturing, and I argue that it will continue to torture, because torture, again, the purpose is not to elicit information, but to break the resistant Palestinian spirit. Now, since the time is limited, I will try to end, but I will end here with perhaps a brighter note. As you might imagine, and as I imagine other prisoners worldwide, they constantly devise their own methods of resistance and of defiance. And this is what I try to describe as torture's other side. Now, I will end with two examples. The first one is from a smuggled, it's a quotation from a smuggled letter from a Palestinian student who was brutalized for nearly a month in a Jerusalem interrogation center. He was subjected to brutal interrogation methods. In the smuggled letter, in which he describes his experience, the military interrogation, he ends by saying, he writes, "How do I conclude my letter? After years of imprisonment and resistance, and following the latest round of successes, failures, and defeats, now I can start again, once again, from the beginning." I think this is the message of defiance that Israel and the Israeli Security Agency cannot break the will of the Palestinian spirit and the will of the Palestinian resistance. And I think what we have seen over the past months here in Palestine is an illustration, an attestation that Israel has failed in its project of colonizing the Palestinian mind, which I think is their intention, and it's more important than colonizing the land for the Israeli establishment. The last thing I will end with, the last example is, and here if Manzoor can show the photo, it belongs. This photo is here. Yes, thank you, Manzoor. So this photo is it's from a house of a demolished Palestinian detainee. This detainee was arrested 2 years ago. His house was demolished for participating in resistance by the Israeli army, of course, which is a practice that Israel calls deterrence policy. This house was demolished, but then after its demolishment, another prisoner was about to be released. So the family of the prisoner has set up this room. They have put the chairs in order to receive this Palestinian prisoner after 18 years of incarceration. So you can imagine that this demolished house, which is Israel, again, Israel always does this policy. It's called deterrence policy. This demolished house was converted as a sign of resistance, as a symbol of hope, and not just hope as a metaphor, for real hope, because it welcomed a Palestinian prisoner after 18 years of incarceration in the same place where Israel tried to demolish, to instill fear, and to demoralize the Palestinian spirit. And I think this photo is an attestation that the Palestinian will, and of course what happened in the past months, that the Palestinian will, the Palestinian resistance will never stop despite Israel's intricate webs of torture and violence. And I thank you.
Thank you very much, Basil. Really appreciate your powerful presentation. And there was a question about the name of the organization that Basil mentioned, which was Ad-Damir, and the link is in the chat in case anyone is interested in checking out their work. I would like now to turn it over to Rai.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation, Project Self. Greetings to folks, greetings to the panelists, and for those of you who are joining today. So just in terms of the brevity of time, I just want to frame my talk for this afternoon in terms of environmental justice and how incarceration is a form of environmental justice. You'll notice in the introduction and in the poster that I have X University, and I just want to speak really quickly about this. And there's a link there that I can also put in the chat if folks are interested. So some of you may or may not be aware of, in Canada, there has been a very staunch push to remove the statue of Egerton Ryerson, the namesake of the university that I teach at, who was one of the foremost architects of residential schools in Canada. And residential schools, which many of you may be familiar with, were schools that were designed to strip Indigenous folks of their culture, their language, essentially their entire being. Kids were removed from their homes and placed in these schools where they faced torture, physical and sexual abuse, mental harm, and just last week,
11 people, one goalkeeper. It's his.
Just last week, 215 children, babies and toddlers, a mass grave was found in Canada of 215 Indigenous children. And so in solidarity with Indigenous resurgence and my colleagues, there are a number of faculty members and staff at Ryerson University who have opted to remove the name Ryerson from our bios, our CVs, any presentations, and replace it with an X in solidarity with the way in which many treaties were signed by Indigenous folks. And so I just wanted to offer up that explanation. There is a link there if folks want some more information about that, and I'm more than happy to discuss that and share some information in the chat. So I've titled my talk today, Environmental Just Us, Carceral Confinement as Geographical State Apparatus. And what I want to do is also offer up a land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you today from Treaty 13 in Takaranto, or referred to commonly as Toronto, but this is the home of This is Turtle Island, and this is the home of traditional territories of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Wendat, and the First Nations folks. And so in offering up this land acknowledgement, it is not a tokenistic gesture. It is really to ground myself as a racialized settler on this land and acknowledge that there is so much work to be done. And specifically because my talk today is going to focus on the entanglement of colonial processes and carceral processes and the disproportionality impacting Indigenous and Black folks in Canada, I really want to offer up this acknowledgement in terms of a call for ontological action, and that I am locating myself as a Black woman, an immigrant to Canada on settler land, and that I bear a responsibility in terms of my movement in this land, my pedagogical practice of this land. I don't normally do dedications, but just given the topic today, I wanted to offer a dedication, not in a trivial way, not to position the images or the narratives of Black and Indigenous death at the forefront, but really to remind us of the importance of this work and that it's and the continuity of this work. Many of you are familiar with Breonna Taylor's tragic passing, less so may be familiar with Regis Korchinski-Paquette, who is an Afro-Indigenous woman who died with police interference in Canada. And Joyce Etricon is an Indigenous woman who died due to medical racism in Quebec, one of our provinces here in Canada. And so I offer up this dedication in honor of them and in the spirit of Black and Indigenous solidarity. And so thinking about a lot of the processes around incarceration, seldom do we make the links of environmental racism and incarceration. And so I really want us to think about the way in which incarceration is a parallel, it's a parallel project of the prison industrial complex that is directly connected not only to systemic racism and white supremacy, but a redlining, right, of particular communities, specifically in Canada, around Indigenous and Black surveillance and policing. And one of the things that happens in Canada in regards to incarceration processes or carceral processes is that we like to compare ourselves a lot to the United States, right? And we like to promote a narrative that really disavows you know, our responsibility, the Canadian state's responsibility in carceral processes. And what happens is oftentimes we compare ourselves to the United States in that we are the polite peacekeepers. We are the folks who don't engage in the overt processes of racism. And that's absolutely not true. In Canada, what we have is a form of democratic racism, a polite form of racism that is grounded in structural oppression, that is guided by white supremacy and is very, very much covert. So you will see this in systemic policies and practices. You will see this in the movement of policing surveillance. You will see this in the educational system, in the healthcare system, in the social welfare system, the subtlety of racism and the way it works. But communities, particularly disproportionately Black and Indigenous communities, are policed and surveyed at a higher rate. And so any conversation around environmental justice or environmental injustice really begins with land back, right? And land, this idea that borders are not fixed, right? But with the onset and the continual genocide and perpetuation of colonialism or neo-colonial processes, what we see is a construction of this idea of borders as fixed, right? And fixed by the Canadian state because land is profitable. And so in Canada, we have numerous campaigns and solidarity movements that are moving in conjunction with this idea of not just giving back land, but what it really means to have ownership of land, right? And so Indigenous folks in Canada have been, and they continue to be displaced up until today. There continues to be a polite form of racism directed towards, you know, reconciliation, which is not really, we haven't really seen that. What we do see is a lot of narrative and a lot of talk and a lot of dismissal of the actuality of colonial processes that have stolen land from Indigenous folks. And so my colleague, Dr. Tobin Haley, says, you know, we can't talk about environmental justice until we actually honor land back. And so when we think of incarceration, right, what I want us to think about is that injustice and criminalization is very much connected to environmental degradation. And the prison system, by, people always ask me, is the system broken? And I always say the system is not broken. The criminal justice system in Canada and in the United States is fundamentally not broken because it is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Right? It was designed to incarcerate, survey those who are the most vulnerable. If we look at the war on drugs and Reaganomics in the United States, we have a very parallel system here in Canada with a law and order agenda or a tough on crime agenda that was promoted by our conservative government 15, 20 years ago, right? So there are these parallel narratives that work in tandem with each other. And the creation of the prison industrial complex was designed to survey Black and Indigenous folks here in Canada. It was designed to survey those who were the most vulnerable in the United States. And we see this constantly being promoted in terms of the degradation of particular types of bodies. We can juxtapose that degradation with environmental injustice, right? But it's not really a juxtaposition, it's a parallel journey, right? It's a constellation of all these different actors that are participating in environmental injustice, i.e. incarceration. So the struggle for environmental justice is always a struggle for freedom, right? We can't separate an ecological sustainability justice movement from a social justice and equity movement. The two work in tandem, and the actual architectural design of carceral spaces as waste sites, as dump sites, really is in parallel with who the state sees as belonging in those spaces, right? So in Canada, we have this narrative that you commit a crime, right? You do the time, so to speak. And I think that's a popular narrative, not only in Canada, but in other global countries as well. However, what is less talked about is the way in which the Canadian state is an actor in the production of carcerality, right? The way in which the taking or the stealing of Indigenous land is an act of violence. The denial of systemic racism in Canada, which happens as a popular narrative, is an act of violence, right? And so all of these processes are directly connected to the surveillance of particular bodies and particular communities. And we see this with Black and Indigenous folks. So last year I published an article called Carceral Redlining, White Supremacy is a Weapon of Mass Incarceration for Indigenous and Black People in Canada. And so these graphics, this was published for the Yellowhead Institute in Canada, and the graphics were created by Yuma Namada. So when I base this work on research and studies that I've done over the years, I've been working in some capacity with folks inside carceral spaces and post-release since 2003, and having participated in grassroots movements and solidarity and support for folks who are incarcerated. And what we have seen is over the past 20 years in Canada, crime rates have actually been declining, but we are seeing an exponential growth in the incarceration of Indigenous and Black folks. And we're seeing a particular exponential growth around Indigenous folks who are being incarcerated for non-violent offenses, the same as Black folks. And so if you look at the trajectory from 2000 to 2020, you see for federally, so these are nationally, federally incarcerated Indigenous population, it has risen exponentially at a fervent rate. And what we know is that most of these charges, or most of these carceral processes, are not only for nonviolent crimes, but they are specifically targeted to folks who are the most disenfranchised, who are the most economically disenfranchised in their society. So you will find people being picked up or charged with breaches because they can't pay a fine, right? So if you are poor and you couldn't pay the first fine, it's very likely you cannot pay the subsequent fine. So we see a warehousing of folks, Indigenous and Black folks, heightened surveillance of Indigenous and Black folks for nonviolent offenses. While Black people in Canada only make up about 3.5% of the overall Canadian population, but yet account for 10% of our federal prison population, right? And Indigenous folks represent about 5% of the Canadian population, but account for 30.4% of the overall federal population. So that disparity is very, very alarming. So I coined this term, carceral redlining, to really look at the ways in which the concept of redlining, which is popularized in the United States around literally demarcating particular neighborhoods and profitable land, and we're now seeing this, this transform into gentrification processes. this process of carceral redlining, I argue, is really about the systemic ways in which carceral practices are state-sanctioned tools of social control, right? And so particular racialized communities are redlined in the carceral sense. They are targeted. There are dilapidated schools. There are heightened surveillance from social welfare systems. There are more policing of single mothers or sole mothers, right? And so this is a structural phenomenon that we're seeing in Canada. So effectively, red lines are drawn around certain individuals and communities, and those individuals and communities are criminalized and targeted for incarceration, right? And so I call this a constellation, like a carceral constellation, where we have a number of different systems working in tandem with each other, right? And all of these are state-sanctioned legal enterprises, right? So the convict lease system popularized in the United States, we also see reformations of that in Canada through the prison industrial complex, right? Racial profiling, the private prison contracts, law enforcement, all of these constellations work in tandem with each other. And so this particular formula of racism, I really feel connects to what Beckett and Mirakawa talk about in their 2012 article around shadow carceral state. And this is what we're seeing particularly in the era of COVID, where not only are we seeing heightened policing and stringent immigration protocols being delivered, but we are seeing other austerity measures. We are seeing punitive power expansion through systems that are not legally recognized as penal, so immigration and family courts or even civic detention centers, right, which are now levying punitive sanctions, right? So which are now detaining folks, right, under the guise of COVID protection. So heightened immigration protocols, right, or more stringent immigration powers being levied. And what these are resulting in, as Beckett and Mirakawa have said, is the ensnaring of an ever larger share of the population through civil injunctions, right? So we are seeing people getting swept up in carceral processes through mechanisms not normally recognized as penal. So this is a particular formula and a particular targeting of racism. And just in terms of brevity, I won't go through this too much, but some examples we see, this is an immigration detention center in Laval, Quebec, Quebec being a province in Canada. We are seeing, again, environmental harms of incarcerated folks, people who are caged, who haven't been formally charged with a criminal process, but because of these austerity measures and because of carceral measures in the shadow carceral state, the state is able to hold them indefinitely on immigration holds, right? Some of you may be familiar with some of these other cases here in other detention centers, one in Texas, one in Pennsylvania, and the Brooklyn Detention Center. Again, highly, highly controversial, highly problematic situations where human rights violations are being and have happened to folks, where folks who are incarcerated have been denied clean access to water, electricity, and heat for days. And again, the parallel around incarceration being very much an environmental racist process. And so just to quickly move along, this is just another detention center. I wanted to highlight, because of course, talking about incarceration really means for me a visioning around abolition, right? And abolition is not a utopian concept. It is a very real concept. It is practical. And I want to borrow from the work of Palestinian academic Vivian Salahana, who says, you know, we don't actually need to provide the state, right? We don't actually need, we being folks who are abolitionists, don't need to provide a reason or a roadmap or a plan for wanting to leave a system of denigration, right? And she compares, Dr. Salahana compares the carceral state to an abusive relationship, right? And that you don't need to provide your abuser with an exit plan. You have the right to leave, right? And so we have the right to promote abolition perspectives, and we have the right to think about decolonization in a way that really grounds this work in radical resistance, right? So by looking at the complexities of decolonization and by recognizing that as racialized folks, there are folks who participate in projects of colonialism or white adjacency, right? There are folks who are racialized, who unfortunately participate in anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, right? Because of the history of colonialism, because colonialism has fundamentally taught folks that the way to succeed is to promote and support harm of folks who are deemed less than you, right? So we have to have those complex and those difficult conversations. And we have to recognize that ongoing colonization and decolonization struggles must be foundational to our understanding of how racism works. There is no conversation about incarceration without a particular lens around what an abolitionist resistance can look like, right? And so if we look at the work of Mumia Abu-Jamal, right? And I just borrowed one of his many quotes here. Abolitionists, simply put, are those beings who look out upon their time and say no, right? And we recognize that for many, many, many of us, the reckoning of George Floyd's death and of Breonna Taylor's death is not new. It is not new, right? For fundamentally, we have been living in a racial pandemic for 400 years plus, since 1619, some would say, right? Since the Middle Passage. And so having conversations about abolition is about really affirming, life affirming, you know, the purpose and the premise behind an abolitionist politics, right? And so I'm gonna leave it there. And just remind folks that there are a number of grassroots organizations in Canada. I've listed some of them here. I volunteer with Keepsakes organization, which is an organization that supports folks and families of incarcerated and post-release. There's the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project. Of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Report is really, really important because there were 94 recommendations in that report in terms of Canada's responsibility in acknowledging and doing work towards dismantling ongoing colonialism and genocide perpetuated against Indigenous folks. And there's a really fabulous website called Everyday Abolition, which I encourage folks to check out, which really looks at the way in which regular folks, so to speak, and their acts of abolition, how they're imparting those in their lives. And just some more references here. I will put these in the chat if folks are interested in some of these other organizations in partnership and research imperatives. So I just want to remind folks, and these are not my quotes, that this work is really grounded in a fundamental understanding of incarceration as a form of environmental racism. And the parallels that are drawn between the degradation of Black Indigenous bodies is really much about the degradation of the environment and how we connect those two pieces, right? And if equality and equity feels like oppression, it's because you're accustomed to privilege. So every time there's a challenge against, using Black Lives Matter or Indigenous Lives Matter, and there's resistance to that, that in and of itself is an act of violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. I appreciate your presentation. And I know that you have to leave in about 20 minutes, but hopefully we can stay in touch, and we definitely appreciated and benefited a lot from your presentation. Thank you. I would like now to turn it over to Ahmed, who's going to be talking to us about the Kashmiri context.
Yeah, am I audible to all of you?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so when we speak of Kashmir, or when we speak of colonized territories in general, or when we speak of incarceration in colonized territories, one of the oft-repeated and common assertions that we come across in the case of Kashmir especially is that it's marked by a condition of lawlessness. But the problem with such an argument is that it presupposes that there is this stable and steady system of law against which lawlessness stands as a kind of anomaly. So one has to remember that when you talk about law, it's reformulation, it's suspension, it's application. All of these are malleable instruments of domination in the colonial epistemic and political arsenal. So the fact that Kashmiris are subjected to Indian laws is a problem. And these laws are not here to provide justice to Kashmiris. And I'll come back to this in detail a little later. But the people of Kashmir resist India's colonization of Kashmir, or they resist India's occupation of Kashmir, and this is why they are jailed. So it's not as though they are seeking rights from within the Indian system, and it's not as though they are complaining that the Indian state is not giving them rights. What they contend is that the Indian state must not have the power or the position to confer on them any right or take them away from it. So it's this power, it's this subjection that they challenge, and it's this subjection that characterizes colonialism in general. Take, for example, this law that the Indian state has regularly used against Kashmiri. It's called the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. So one of the clauses, and under this law, you can jail Kashmiris who are booked under this law for up to 5 years, and it can stretch to at least 14 years. So one of the clauses of this law is that anyone who speaks or acts in any way that the Indian state deems prejudicial to its interests is a criminal. And basically, if anyone creates disaffection against the state of India, he is a criminal as well. And it's a crime that the Indian Assembly and the judiciary properly ratifies and validates. Now, what can a colonized population feel for the colonizing state besides disaffection? And the entire population of Kashmir feels disaffection towards the Indian state. And the same, and another clause in the same act criminalizes any act or speech that threatens verbally or physically the sovereignty of the Indian state. Now, for long, the Indian state has maintained that Kashmir is an integral part of India, that it has not occupied it, that it has not colonized it. Now, but if you ask a Kashmiri whether or not he or she recognizes the sovereignty of the Indian state over Kashmir, they would tell you no. The answer would be a resounding no. But for the Indian state, the colonization of Kashmir constitutes its very sovereignty. So, according to this law, therefore, anyone who resists, India's rule in Kashmir is a criminal. And if you ask the Kashmiri political prisoners, do they recognize India's sovereignty over Kashmir? The answer would be no. So, you have these laws, therefore, and when a Kashmiri is jailed, it's not that law is not being applied properly. So, law here is not a solution, but it's part of the problem. And this is something very important for us to understand, that Kashmiris cannot turn to a domestic legal framework. It's not available to them because this domestic legal framework exists in the first place to decriminalize India's colonization of Kashmir, criminalize the resistance that Kashmiris offer to this act of colonization, and to also create this image of the Indian state as though, in the eyes of international community, if there is a thing called that, that Indian state is a state that adheres to principles of justice, that there is the rule of law. But we Kashmiris say that that is precisely the problem, that we are subjected to the laws of the colonial state, a state that we do not deem our own, a state that we deem an occupier. And this is something that's very important to understand. So another thing that's very important for us to remember is that there is this act that Kashmiris have been for long subjected to. It's called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And under this act, it provides the Indian troops with powers to shoot to kill, conduct warrantless searches, and detain people arbitrarily, all of which they have regularly done. Now, India's colonization of Kashmir, or Israel's colonization of Palestine, or any place that is marked by a condition of coloniality, one of the things that we have to remember is that it's not typified by militarization alone. It's not typified by cultural imperialism alone, but it's first and foremost characterized by the power that the colonial state wields. And this power is not subjected to any rule. It's not subjected to any law other than the will of the colonial state itself. So the will of the colonial state is in fact the law. And now when you talk of Kashmir political prisoners, for example, we have thousands of Kashmir prisoners who are in different jails at the moment. We have people in prison in Kashmir, and these prisoners include women. We have many women who are in jails in New Delhi, which is the capital of the Indian state. And the charge against most of these women is that they have threatened India's sovereignty, that they have waged a war against the Indian state, and that they have
finishing the doctoral program in the Department of Art History.
That what they're doing is in fact prejudicial to the interests of the colonial state. And then we have many teenagers who are in jail, and we have old people who are in jail. And all of these people have been kept away thousands of miles away from their homes and their families. And ever since you have this COVID-19 pandemic, their families cannot reach out to them because there is this lockdown. We all know how bad the things have been in India concerning COVID. So their families cannot reach out to them. And if they write letters to them, those letters do not reach them because the post offices are shut as well. And then we had a recent death that occurred. There was this Kashmiri resistance leader, an anti-colonial resistance leader who was in jail, and he was close to 80 years old, and he was kept in prison, and he was deprived of any health facilities. And it's a norm, it's not an exception. And that's something we have to remember as well, that it's normal. It does not surprise Kashmiris. The Indian state never disappoints Kashmiris because oppression is precisely what they expect from them, and oppression is what they get. So this 80-year-old man was kept in prison. And for months and months on, he was deprived of any medical care. And his condition was really critical. And right when he was on the verge of death, right when he was on the brink of death, he was shifted to a hospital just so the Indian state could say that we have done our bit and it's a natural death. But we have to remember that these are not natural deaths. These are people who are ill. These are people who are old and sick. And they are in jail for a cause, and the cause is of liberation. So it's not as though they are just victims. They're agents. They're people who exercise their agency, and they could have, sat in their homes, lived their personal lives very comfortably. But they chose to resist colonization. And once you do that, you cannot expect comfort. You cannot expect ease. The state is going to come after you with all the power that it has. So this old man was kept in prison, and he passed away in prison. And then his son was called, and he was asked to take the dead body of his father. And then they were not even allowed to, carry out the funeral properly, because the Indian state feared that if there were to be a funeral, it would mobilize people against the Indian state and what it has done. So this is, the level of atrocities that we have been seeing in Kashmir. And for long, the conversation on Kashmir, the story of Kashmir has kind of been obfuscated, if you will. People do talk about, oppression taking place in other parts of the world, but the conversation on Kashmir has kind of been invisibilized, as though Kashmiri Muslims don't exist, as though it's not a problem. And that has been, and part of it has to do with how, there is this conception that things have gotten worse after Narendra Modi came into power, after the BJP came into power. But we must also remember that the people of Kashmir are being jailed, brutalized since 1947. And this story of colonization began in 1947. It did not begin in 2014 when the BJP came into power. So the secular nationalist Indian National Congress jailed as many Kashmiri as the BJP did. So the people of Kashmir are not fighting for regime change. They're not fighting for a change in government. They're fighting for an end to occupation. They're fighting for liberation from India's judiciary, India's legislature, India's military, and all the institutions that represent the Indian state in Kashmir. And I witnessed this in my own home, so I do not have to learn it from books. And thousands of other Kashmiri kids did too. I was 7 months old, rather 2 months old, when my father was jailed. I don't even have any memories of that day. And ever since that day, he has been in prison. And at first, his sentence was kept to 14 years. And when he completed 14 years, it was stretched to 20. And when he completed 20 years, it was stretched to life till death. So that's the kind of impunity with which the Indian state operates in Kashmir. And my mother is in prison too, and she's not the only woman. My father is not the only man. We have other people too who have been in prison since the 1990s, and who have been in prison, for all these decades now. And if the Indian state deems Kashmiris living outside of jails as killable and disposable and dispensable, one can only imagine how it treats the people who are inside. Prisons, who are kept away from, public gaze, who are kept away from their own people. And there's this intimate way, occupation affects you. When we get to speak to our family members in jail, we are allowed 5 or 6 minutes of phone call. And when we speak to them, there is this policewoman who stands beside them, constantly reminding them of the fact that time is running out. And this desperation and this dejection you feel in that moment, because here you have a stranger dictating the terms of your own conversation with your, let's say, mother, your father, your brother, your sister, right? So you have this, so occupation is not just a political issue, it's a personal issue for all Kashmiris. It's not an issue that they can, just let go of. It reaches you in your home. It breaks your family, tears apart your, homes as well. So that's something important for us to remember as well. There is this mockery of justice that happens in the case of Kashmir. There was this a woman who was in prison, and she filed an application in the court seeking to be allowed that she should be permitted to keep some books in her cell because she was fond of reading, she was used to reading, and she just wanted to do something so that she could be occupied because all they have is four walls to keep them company. So when she filed this application, the judge told her that she should spend her time reading the charge sheet instead, and maybe regret what she has done. So they don't even allow people the possession of books. They don't even allow them this basic comfort because the point is to inflict pain. The point is to increase the cost of resistance so that the people of Kashmir feel that resisting occupation is something that would entail great costs, great intimate and private costs, and they should not therefore do it. And there's also this project of normalcy that constantly the Indian state, architects in Kashmir. But what's important for us to remember is that there is no place for dejection and despair, and that is what the people of Kashmir think too. For them, colonization is abnormal, occupation is abnormal, and resisting it is normal, and suffering in the pursuit of resisting it is normal. And just being at your home feeling indifferent to what is happening around you is not normal. That is what is abnormal. And this is something that the children in Kashmir kind of grow up, and they have this internalized this idea because they have grown up in this conflict, and occupation has been their reality. And the Indian state does try to impose this as the only possible reality. But what Kashmiris do is that they do dare to imagine a reality outside of it. They do imagine that this is not the only reality, that occupation is not a fact of life, that it can be changed. And this is something that is a source of great hope for Kashmiris and for other people living under colonization as well. And the last point that I would like to make is that there is great talk about peace and reconciliation. But one must remember that no reconciliation or peace is possible between the colonizer and the colonized because the two essentially do not share a definition of peace, right? They do not share a definition of justice. There is great talk about appealing to humanity, but the colonizer does not deem the colonized population as human, right? So what humanity, what shared principles of humanity are we talking about exactly? What appeal to law are we talking about? What appeal to morality are we talking about when the colonized and the colonizer do not share these conceptions? So you have this, the colonizing state, in the case of Kashmir, is the Indian state, and its interest lies in subjugating Kashmiris. And for the Indians, for Kashmiris, their interest lies in resisting this colonization. So there is this antagonistic relationship that they share amongst themselves. So for the Indian state, peace is a condition where the Kashmiris come to terms with occupation, where they accept it, where they submit to it, where they, accept it as the only possible way of living. And for the people of Kashmir, life and peace can only materialize from the death of colonization. So as Fanon says, for the colonized people, life materializes from the rotting, cadaver of the colonizing state. And also that the colonizing state only loosens its hold when the sword is at its neck. So while we do have these conversations, it's also important to understand that it's power that is at the heart of occupation. It's not as though the occupier came and they started talking to the colonizing population and they had this rational argument in which the colonizing state emerged as winner. It's power that we're talking about, brute military power. And it's this power, until we don't dismantle and think about how this dismantling would happen, we will have people in prisons. We will have people being jailed for more than 20 years, more than 15 years, with no one caring about them, with them dying in prison. We have Kashmiris who are in prison, and their family members have not been even allowed their dead bodies because they fear that these dead bodies could be sites of resistance, could be sites of mobilization. So they even fear the dead bodies of Kashmiri Muslims who resist colonization. So it's important for us to remember all these things. And thank you for having me here, and thank you for giving Kashmir the due part in the conversation that happens in the conditions of coloniality, in the conditions of colonization all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. I would like to turn it over to Azeezah now.
Thank you, Azadeh, Manzoor, all the organizers, and thank you to my fellow speakers. I am so honored to be on this panel with people who are resisting incarceration against some of the harshest edges of state violence. It's an honor to be on this panel with you. Salam, everyone. Greetings of peace. Like Dr. Reece, I'm speaking to you from Takaranto, often known as Toronto, the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat people, territories that they have lived on for many thousands of years and continue to defend even in the face of extreme colonial state violence. I want to begin by honoring and collectively mourning the 215 children whose bodies were found in a mass grave outside Kamloops residential school recently, and all of the children who were tortured and killed in this genocidal residential school system. The discovery of this mass grave has reinvigorated a conversation in Canada and internationally about whether this constitutes genocide. But the truth is, we should not have needed to discover the skeletons of children buried in the ground to know that Canada is a country that has been founded on genocide. And it is not only the torture and the killing of these children that constitutes genocide, but the very existence of the residential schools in and of themselves qualifies as an act of genocide, an attempt and an act of forcibly separating children from their communities with the intent of destroying a people as a people, which is the defining characteristic of genocide under the UN Genocide Convention and international law. Reading the letters of children to their parents from these schools and listening to the testimonies of survivors from these residential schools, a description that comes up again and again and again is that these schools were like jails. These schools were like jails. And this reminds us that when we are talking about incarceration as a tool of colonialism, we are not only talking about the system that calls itself the criminal justice system, or as Dr. Reece said, the criminal just us system. And we are not only talking about those buildings that overtly identify themselves as prisons and jails. Rather, we are talking about the whole panoply, the whole constellation of intertwined, interconnected institutions developed in order to control the movement, the behavior, and even the thoughts of the people, lands, and other than human creatures that have been placed under colonial sovereignty and law. And so when we're talking about colonial incarceration, we also have to talk about the barbed wire and the walls and the drones and the military presence that have turned entire territories like Gaza and Kashmir into open air prisons. And we also have to talk about the alternatives to incarceration, the supposed alternatives to incarceration, means of surveillance and house arrest and electronic monitoring that turn people into prisoners in their own homes. People like Canadian security certificate detainee Mohammed Harkat, for example, who has not been accused of any crime, but under security immigration law has been subject to some of the harshest house arrest conditions in Canadian history. So harsh and so disruptive, not only to himself, but his entire family, that he said that he would rather return to the prison in which he was previously housed, a prison known in Canada as Guantanamo North. When we talk about incarceration as a tool of colonialism, we also have to talk about all of those violent mechanisms to control these borders that have been drawn to dismember colonial territories and control the flow of movement and people across them, so that while weapons and capital are permitted to flow freely, people, often fleeing the violent effects of the traffic of that same violence and capital, are permitted from finding refuge from those conditions of violence. In Canada, as in many other places, and we saw some of this in Dr. Reece's presentation, people who are subject to immigration detention are subject to many of the same mechanisms of punishment and penalization in the criminal system without even those minimal safeguards that are accorded to those in the criminal system. So that in Canada, for instance, immigration detainees can be subject to indefinite immigration detention, and also, according to human rights organizations, fall into a legal black hole between different jurisdictions so that they completely disappear out of sight. When we talk about incarceration as a tool of colonialism, we also have to talk about all of the institutions and discourses of psychiatry that have been deployed in order to psychopathologize those who are subject to racist and colonial violence as themselves being pathological in order to justify additional forms of control and coercion over them. And we know there is a very long history of this, from the enslaved Black people escaping enslavement who were diagnosed with this fictitious psychiatric condition of drapetomania, to the CIA's diagnosis of civil rights protesters, including Malcolm X, diagnosing them with schizophrenia, to the incarceration of Indigenous people in specialized asylums in order to strip them of their communities and culture, an effort to destroy a people as a people, to return to the language of the Genocide Convention and international law. In order to understand how incarceration functions as a tool of colonial dehumanization, we also have to look at the factory farms and the industrial food production system, which has caged and tortured and killed so many millions of those who are, so many million not other than human creatures. Torture and killing and violence, which, as in the human incarceration system, is increasingly placed behind walls of informational control with the proliferation of ag-gag laws, including in Ontario and Quebec. And so when we think about why dehumanization is such a catastrophe for people, it is because we have legitimized and authorized almost unlimited amounts of violence to be applied against those who are deemed other than human, starting with those humans who are subject to the extraordinary violence of the factory farming system. Finally, in order to understand how incarceration functions as a tool of domestic colonialism, we have to understand how incarceration functions as a tool of transnational and international colonization. That incarceration is not only a tool of policing within the state, but it is also a tool and an instrument and a weapon of war beyond the borders of the state, from Guantanamo Bay to Abu Ghraib to Bagram Air Base to the CIA black sites, so that many of those very same torturers implicated in the abuses at places like Abu Ghraib honed their torture skills in the prisons within the United States. And indeed, the Abu Ghraib prison itself was constructed through the direction of American architects America 40 years later, returning to Abu Ghraib to perform those horrific tortures whose photos shocked the world. And so when we talk about the militarization of police, the militarization of domestic institutions of violence, we have to understand that the problem is not that military logic is infecting domestic violence, such as police, but that military and police have always been intertwined logically, legally, historically. Powers of war and powers of police have always been intertwined in colonial contexts in order to create subject colonial populations who are subject to all of the violence of war, but who are denied the right to legitimately use violence in response, as quote unquote enemies in a war are legally entitled to do under international law. War and police have always been intertwined in order to create subject colonial populations who are subject to all of the violence of war, but are accorded none of the privilege of combatants. And so we see how the same drones that are produced by Israeli companies that advertise their products as battle tested on Palestinians are also used to terrorize migrants at the US-Mexico border, used to terrorize indigenous people on reserves in Arizona, are used to terrorize people in the colony of Kashmir, and are now also being purchased by the Canadian government in order to augment its surveillance over colonized Arctic waters, people, and land. The same security companies that manufacture the perimeter the apartheid wall that cages the people of Gaza have also been commissioned to construct the border wall that separates US and Mexico, have also been commissioned to provide equipment for the border wall in Kashmir, and have also provided the perimeter security equipment that that securitizes the Canadian prisons that incarcerate ever-increasing numbers of Black and Indigenous people behind bars. And the tear gas that burns the eyes and the throats of protesters from Ferguson to Gaza was originally developed by British colonizers in order to enforce their colonial sovereignty in the world, and was trafficked to the US through the war in Vietnam, where before it was deployed against American protesters, Black protesters in the US, was deployed to singe the skin of the people in Vietnam under American military power. And yet they say that we are the ones who need to be incarcerated and punished and controlled. The Palestinian legal academic Nimar Soltani has said that all colonial systems maintain themselves by separating what is actually intimately connected, by separating peoples, by separating lands, and by separating concepts, so that we cannot draw connections between things which are intimately connected. We cannot understand or deconstruct colonial violence using the very same analytic categories that have been used to construct colonial violence in the first place. Here versus there, domestic versus foreign, private versus public, war versus police. Around the world, Indigenous peoples are showing us what it means to think and live beyond these categories, to build new worlds unconfined by colonial ontologies and epistemologies. Yesterday, in Takaranto, the statue of Egerton Ryerson, who, as Dr. Reece mentioned, was one of the architects of the residential schools with which I began my talk, the statue of Egerton Ryerson was torn down. And the university administrators have said that it will not be resurrected. This is a reminder to us that even these edifices of violence, which appear so permanent, so intransigent, can always be surmounted. They can always be made to fall. And so, inshallah, in the not so distant future, we look forward to a time beyond the settler colonial present, when all the racist statues have been toppled, when all of the prison and apartheid walls have been crumbled, and when we can travel freely from liberated Turtle Island to liberated Palestine to liberated Kashmir, inshallah. Thank you, everyone, and salam, greetings of peace.
Thank you very much, Azeezah. And I would like to turn it over to Priyanka.
Thank you so much. It's an incredible honor and so humbling to be with the powerhouse panel that we have here today. I'll be talking a little bit about our fight to end immigrant detention centers here in Georgia. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I believe Mansoor is pulling up right now. Perfect. So when Dr. Rai was talking about surveillance, and we can go to the next slide, Mansoor, surveillance of Black, Indigenous, and Brown people, the prison industrial complex, and the carceral constellation in Canada, it really resonated with me because the same thing is happening here. Georgia is among the top 4 states with the highest incarceration rate in the country, and one of the top 5 states with the highest number of people in immigration detention daily. So it has been a long, hard fight for Project South and many of our partners on the ground, including the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights and Georgia Detention Watch. So when I started working at Project South back in 2017, we were up against 4 large detention centers. 3 were privately operated by multi-billion-dollar corporations, and 1 at the time was owned and operated by the city of Atlanta, which was ironic because Atlanta at the time was saying it was a welcoming city for immigrants. And yet it was making $6 million a year to imprison them. And it was shocking because I remember literally talking to a city council member who told me that he had no idea that the jail had a contract to detain immigrants. And so this was happening in our own backyard and people did not know about it. It was after working with Georgia Detention Watch with Pilar, where there was a visitation program where we uncovered horrifying human rights abuses. And we can go to the next slide now. In 2018, we published a report on the abuses, really uplifting the voices of those who were detained. The abuses ranged anything from sexual assault to lack of medical care to aggressive use of solitary confinement to even individuals dying inside the jail due to improper care. And yet, despite all of this, the chief of the jail, who is now actually the sheriff of the county, completely denies that there were any issues at the jail. After a lot of organizing, we were actually able to make sure that formerly detained immigrants had a seat at the table that the mayor had convened to decide what Atlanta would do, whether it would end the contract or not. And honestly, that in and of itself was a challenge. During that time, there was a rhetoric that the city jail was somehow more ethical because it was publicly owned. Well, we knew that was not true, and we had illustrated that in our report. But because of the formerly detained individuals on the mayor's commission, they were the ones who were able to sway the other members of the commission to finally end the contract. And so this is one example of how working directly with people who are impacted is so important. One powerful moment that I will never forget is when I had done several legal visits with an immigrant at the jail. who had gone through a horror of issues. And he was telling me about the abuses that he and the other men were enduring in what they called the labor program. And during our third or fourth visit, he told me that after I had talked to him about the standard of care that the jail was obligated to provide, he had organized with the rest of the men in the labor program to write an incredibly powerful collective letter to share with the city council. Of course, they were detained, so were not able to come and testify on their own, but we coordinated with his wife to come to the city council meeting and testify using the letter that the men had wrote. So I want to go ahead and play that video now.
What happens at ACDC when one works for ACDC, and the ways in which the city of Atlanta is culpable with what is being done to the detainees on the work detail. First of all, they are not paid. They signed up to work because they wanted to make money to defray the cost of commissary items that are so expensive so that they could have money to call their families. The system is organized so that detainees are starved and have no recourse but to buy commissary items at exorbitant prices. They signed up to work 1 shift per day, but have been coerced and forced into working 2 shifts. My husband works 2 shifts, 7 days a week, without break. He works more than 40 hours a week. He cannot get any sleep except for 1 or 2 hours at a time, the way the shifts are organized. Also, they were never told that they would be handling hazardous chemicals, industrial strength chemicals. They are given no protective gear. Lots of these chemicals require goggles, face masks. They are carcinogenic. They affect the liver, kidneys, spleen. They affect fertility, damage the testes, and these men are exposed. My husband has had peeling hands and fingernails for months and months. There is no help. He has been injured because of damaged kitchen equipment. He has a puncture wound on his hand. He has not gotten antibiotics. He has not gotten tetanus shots. He has worked with open wounds in these chemicals.
I'll go ahead and share the link with everyone now. It was incredibly powerful testimony from the wife of the man who was detained, talking about how her husband, was made to work without sleeping, without eating. He did not receive any type of protection. He worked in the kitchen. He injured himself and did not receive any medication. But I highly recommend everyone to go and watch that video. And after that meeting, we continue to organize to make sure that the city officials heard directly from impacted communities. So in 2018, the mayor ended the contract to detain immigrants, which was a huge victory. But what we know is that what was happening on the immigrant side of the jail was also happening on the city side. The same abuses were happening. And so our fight is not over. We are continuing to support our partner organizations like Women on the Rise to shut down the jail altogether. Mansoor, if you can pull up the PowerPoint one more time, I can go on to talk about, other than the Atlanta jail, we've also been in a battle to shut down the other detention centers in Georgia as well. So we can go to the fourth slide. So most recently, after organizing for years and working with directly impacted people, we were able to pressure the federal government to end the ICE contract at Irwin. And the monumental victory was a result of the brave immigrants and workers who spoke up about the abuse happening. We've been working with partners to talk with detained immigrants and document the abuses, just like in the Atlanta context. The abuses include a lack of prenatal care for women, lack of medical care where individuals with HIV and breast cancer do not receive their medication, aggressive use of solitary confinement, and retaliation. It felt like we had tried everything. We wrote congressional letters, we filed federal complaints, we brought the abuses to elected officials, we did international advocacy, we did many direct actions supporting our partners. And it wasn't until we filed the Office of Inspector General complaints last September that finally the abuses at Irwin finally got attention. The OIG complaint had included detailed accounts from whistleblower nurse Dawn Muwatin and detained immigrant men and women who talked about the lack of COVID-19 protocol and the lack of medical care, including the invasive gynecological procedures happening to immigrant women without their consent. I remember talking to Wendy Dow in 2019 while she was detained at Irwin, who had mentioned to me the horrible treatment she had received at Irwin, and also mentioned the alarming number of women who had undergone invasive procedures, and that she did not trust what was happening. Wendy has since gone public with this information. And after that, I had talked to multiple different partner organizations who were also in communication with detained women at Irwin, who were also hearing the same thing. Then in 2020, while we were writing the OIG complaint, I had talked to another detained woman who also has gone public with her account, who bravely shared with me her horrifying experience of not being told what was happening to her own body. She had no idea what procedure she was going to have done. And she told me that many other women had gone through the same thing, where they would have invasive gynecological procedures without understanding what was happening. And much of this information was verified by Dawn Muwatin as well when we talked. And so we knew we had to bring it to light in order for there to be a full investigation into these horrifying reports. Since filing our complaint, there has been an international level of attention to the issue. More than 40 impacted women have come forward. There's also a class action lawsuit on behalf of the women that we are part of, and we're continuing to work with partners to support the women. At the time of filing the report, I actually did not know that Wendy herself was a survivor of the abuse. She had already been deported to Jamaica when we wrote and filed the complaint. It was after filing the complaint that I was able to get in contact with her. And what I heard from her was horrifying. And so again, I want to reiterate, it is because of the bravery and courage and the resilience of these people to speak out that we were able to support the truth coming out and to continue to pressure the shutdown of Irwin County Detention Center. So I want to go ahead and end by sharing a video of Wendy herself.
I'm Wendy Dow. I'm calling from Kingston, Jamaica. I feel it necessary to come on this seminar and voice my concerns and everything that's going on with me as a Black immigrant. come to America over a decade, over 20 years. I was in the Irving County for a simple violation, traffic violation, and that led me to staying there over 18 months. And while I was there, I was like very ill with hypertension and stomach cramping, and they took me to Dr. Admin, where my fallopian tube was out without my consent, which is I didn't know. First, he said that it was cyst, and then I realized after weeks it was my fallopian tubes. And I'm speaking out because I'm speaking for other immigrants, other Black women like me, not to go through the same thing that I went through. Because after I had that surgery, I had infection in my stomach, infection under my stomach, around my navel, and without any help from ICE, any help from the nurses there, and I felt like I was abused. I was abused by the American government with ICE and everything that going in there. And I feel like, I need to speak out to see if I can make a difference.
Priyanka just put a link to the video in the chat, and thank you so much, Priyanka, for your powerful presentation. We only have a couple minutes for question and answer. Thank you so much to all the presenters for the really, really powerful presentations. If anybody has any questions, I think we might have time for maybe a couple questions. Please feel free to put it in the chat or speak up now. And we will share a recording of this webinar in addition to the resources, the articles and everything that were shared with the attendees.
There was a question I want to repeat for Ahmed, and it was, let me see, about the role of, how do you look at Pakistan's role in relation to Kashmir? So Ahmed, I don't know if you want to answer that.
Yeah, sure, I can do it. So could you repeat the question for me?
The question is, how do you see the role of Pakistan in relation to Kashmir or Kashmir freedom movement?
See, Pakistan, for those who don't know, is, it's a country right beside India, and it's India's neighboring country, and it's a Muslim majority country. So Pakistan's role in Kashmir, first of all, it is there. You can't deny it, because if even a cursory study of Kashmir's history would reveal that Pakistan has been there, right, since 1947. And more importantly, there is a part of disputed territory that is with Pakistan at the moment. So Pakistan is the administrator of that part of the disputed territory of Jammu and Kashmir, if you talk about the entire state of Jammu and Kashmir. So one cannot therefore say that Pakistan has nothing to do with it. And more importantly, if you ask a vast majority of Kashmiris, they see Pakistan, not the government necessarily, but the people of Pakistan as their allies, as people who have, because the people of Kashmir, the Indian state has regularly, shut internet in Kashmir, and it has blocked the voices of Kashmiris from from the people outside of, Kashmir. So then the people of Pakistan have been one of the most vocal supporters of the liberation of the Kashmiri people. Therefore, there is a positive relationship that the Kashmiri Muslims feel they have with Pakistan, the people of Pakistan, not necessarily the ruling dispensation, but definitely Pakistani people have a very important role to play in the dispute of Kashmir, because first, as I said, there is a part of Kashmir that is in Pakistan's administration, and also because the people of Kashmir expect that the people of Pakistan, because they are so close and they have witnessed so closely, there are many Kashmiri refugees who had to leave Kashmir because of the oppression of the Indian state, and not just right now, but if you go back to history, you know, even before 1947, when Kashmiris were living under Dogra and Sikh regimes, you know, imperial regimes, even then many Kashmiris, many Kashmiri Muslims, because of economic exploitation, because of difficult living conditions, because they were not allowed to, you know, even practice their religion, prayers were banned, mosques were turned into stables. So many Kashmiris left Kashmir and they migrated to Pakistan in parts that today constitute Pakistan, Punjab and other parts of Pakistan as well. So therefore, Pakistan has closely witnessed what has been happening in Kashmir. So therefore, onus lies on the people of Pakistan to, you know, be very vocal in supporting the cause of the liberation of the Kashmiri people, because while the story of Kashmir is new for many people outside of Kashmir, you know, in the United States, in United Kingdom, and in Europe and other parts of the world, and for many, they don't even know what Kashmir is. You know, I was once talking to someone and he thought that Kashmir is a type of shawl that women wear. You know, so that's the kind of unawareness you find. So therefore, because the people of Pakistan have closely witnessed it, they know a lot more about it, and with knowledge comes responsibility. So therefore, I do believe they have a very significant role to play in it. And as I said, Kashmiris do view them as important allies. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That is a powerful presentation for everyone. There was one question for Basil, and somebody addressed, but if you also want to address, and it was whether Israeli torture is only restricted to Muslims or non-Muslim or Christian Palestinians too. So we wanted to see if you want to address that.
No. Well, thanks. No, of course, it's directed against all Palestinians. I mean, it's important to note that the Israeli regime categorizes Palestinians as a threat as a whole, and you know, these kind of racial and you know, ethnic classifications do not really matter for the Israeli state, because at the end it's a colonial regime that functions on the displacement and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian population, which is the indigenous population that to which the land belongs. So actually, these categories do not function and should not function, actually, for that matter, because it is a political struggle at the end. It's a struggle for human rights, for equality, but most importantly for self-determination, which Israel denies for all the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think there's one question or comment about why, you know, Canada is seen as so progressive compared to USA. And definitely there's so many, you know, abuses we know in USA, but Canada is portrayed as, you know, really liberal or progressive space, whereas what we are hearing from Dr. Reece and Azeezah is a different picture. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Azeezah.
In Canada, too, there is this self-perception that Canada is a multicultural haven, a progressive utopia in comparison to the United States. And this also obviously serves to reinforce the ruling racial regime in Canada itself by perpetually obscuring it, by perpetually deferring calls for racial justice in Canada, by saying you should all just be grateful that you don't live in the United States. But in fact, when we look at a legal and policy level, in some ways, Canada's policies are even more extreme than what we see in the United States. For example, just recently we have in Quebec, in the name of secularism, a law prohibiting people from wearing religious symbols in public office, and this is particularly targeting women in hijab. It's the culmination of a long campaign to exclude and expel visibly Muslim women from public space. And this is something that not even Donald Trump proposed doing. In Canada, we have a law that until very recently was called the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, explicitly calling Muslims and South Asian and Arab communities barbaric by reference to particular practices of gendered violence that are stereotypically associated with these communities. And while the name of this law was recently changed, the very problematic substance of it remains intact. Again, this is something that Donald Trump introduced in one of his executive measures, but it was later stricken, this idea that we have to keep out Muslims' barbaric cultural practices because it was considered too racially extreme. Similarly, with immigration detention, Canada's regime of indefinite immigration detention that also permits children to be indefinitely detained with their parents is something that was considered to be grotesque when Donald Trump was attempting to radicalize the U.S. system in order to enable children to be detained with their parents indefinitely in the immigration system, which was precisely why why children were being separated from their parents, because there was a restriction on that. And I know the American lawyers are more familiar with that context. But in so many ways, Canadian policies are as bad or worse than the United States, even when you look at disparities in incarceration and police killings. And yet this idea of a separation between Canada and the United States is what enables colonial regimes of racial violence to persist on both sides of the border.
Thank you so much. I am actually adding some articles in the chat section that Azeezah shared. There was one question also, what are your organizations doing about it, or whether they're doing, and we already heard about Adamir. It's already in the chat section. Project South, Priyanka just mentioned, our work in challenging detention in Georgia. We have been able to shut down Atlanta City Detention Center and Urban County recently. And I can, of course, share this website of Project South you can check out. But yeah, I think I have a question for Ahmed. Zaid, you can either unmute yourself, Zaid, or you can share your question in the chat section. So I don't know, Zaid, if you've been able to unmute yourself. If you're having challenge, then you can add your question in the chat section. Okay, is the conflict in Kashmir a religious issue or a political issue, as Basil talked about it? And that's a question for Ahmed. Yeah, is the conflict in Kashmir a religious issue or a political issue?
Yeah, so am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
That's an interesting question, but the topic, the subject that we're talking about here today is a little different. But I'd like to just make a quick point about it. Colonialism is not just about military, it's not just about violence, it's also about what is referred to as epistemology, about knowledge, right? How you think about things, the meanings that words have. So again, though this is not the subject, these categories that you're talking about are Eurocentric in their nature, right? So if you study the history of Europe, you would realize that these categories were generated in Europe, and these categories came into being as a result of what was actually a Western experience. And I don't see why categories that are epistemologically speaking Eurocentric in nature, I don't see why those categories should be introduced to read the struggles that are not happening in Europe, right? So if you talk about the people of Kashmir, they don't see their life necessarily the way people in West do, right? And they don't have to. If you're talking about decolonization, we have to talk about decolonization of, we have to talk about epistemic decolonization as well. So the people of Kashmir do not necessarily compartmentalize their struggle the way people outside of Kashmir, let's say in Europe and West, in North America might. So if you ask a Kashmiri, is it a religious struggle or is it a political struggle? He would simply tell you that it's a struggle where a Muslim majority population is struggling for liberation. But you cannot separate Muslimness from their struggle, because I would say that to do so would be to manifest or show that you have internalized the discourse of Islamophobia. People should be allowed to resist as who they are. You can't set conditions on it. We would only express solidarity with you if you behave this way. You can't see their struggle, their decolonial struggle, as sight of you know, kind of imposing your understanding of society on their side of struggle. That we will only support your struggle if it results in the society that we like to see. That's not decolonization, right? That's not decolonization. So you have to talk about epistemic decolonization. For the people of Kashmir, it's neither a religious struggle nor a political struggle, because we don't subscribe to these categories, and that's something that's how Kashmiris see it.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, we are above our time. Our time was 1.5 hours, but it's such an important discussion and so powerful stories folks have shared. Really honored to have folks from Palestine, from Kashmir, you know, from Canada, the occupied land that we are inhabiting here, to see the connections between the struggles and seeing incarceration as a tool of colonialism. We will share the video recording and the resources. So thank you once again, and I'll give it to Azeezah for any last remarks.
Yeah, thank you all. Definitely would like to thank the presenters again and look forward to staying in touch. Just one update related to the campaign around shutting down the Urban County Detention Center that Priyanka talked about, and generally immigration detention in the US. We have learned that a complaint that we had submitted to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is the regional body overseeing the human rights abuses in the Americas, has been accepted for a hearing. So that's going to be on Monday, June 28th at 9 a.m. And hopefully that hearing will be open to the public. So we would welcome all of you all. Also, again, if you could mark your calendar for sometime in September. We don't have a date yet, but there will be a webinar in September, most likely looking at the post 9/11 abuses by the US government and really the global nature of the US war of terror. So we would like to invite you all to join us for that discussion. And thank you again for joining us, and keep up the fight. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.